All right, hey everybody, how you doing? I'm Dr. Mark Cunningham. I'm happy to be here with everybody today and talking about Paul Laurence Dunbar. So as we start, I would just like first to recognize the title of our theme, which is "We Wear the Mask," by doing a reading of Paul Laurence Dunbar's poem "We Wear the Mask." Now, I don't claim to be as a Maya Angelou, but I do okay. So let me do that for you. We wear the mask. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile, with torn and bleeding hearts, we smile and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise and counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but oh, great Christ, our cries. To thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet and long the mile. But let the world dream otherwise, because we wear the mask. So, Dunbar writes "We Wear the Mask," after the Civil War, around in 1800s, of course, right? 1896 in particular is when it was first published. But he wrote this poem as of course, a lyrical poem to kind of talk about the lives of African Americans after the Civil War, okay? And more specifically, to kind of talk about how African Americans or Black people at that time had to pretend, right, that everything was good, everything was better, that in fact the mental torture that they had been through and were currently experiencing was non-existent. And this is a situation, so to speak, or certainly a practice, I will say, that we have had to engage in as Black people even currently right now. And so that's what we want to talk about today. So, in speaking with the festival organizer, Rosalind, kind of talked about this notion or idea of like, how do we see We Wear the Mask or in the themes of Dunbar's work? How do we see that in our present day? And how do we see that, particularly now with everything that's going on with the George Floyd situation, now with our little brother Elijah, so much of that, right, that we are having to think about and consider. And, I want to end this, right, in asking the question.
Dr. Cunningham, we're hearing some mic interference. Are you moving around?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Something's going on.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. And so we want to kind of talk about, okay, I'll get back on play. Anyway, but we want to kind of talk about, are we at the place where we can demask? Are we at the place where we no longer have to consider wearing the mask? And so this is what we want to kind of talk about. So, in doing that first, I would like to kind of talk about Paul Laurence Dunbar and his background first, to kind of touch on that a bit. So Dunbar, of course, happy birthday, born today in 1872 specifically. He was one of the first kind of African Americans to kind of gain national recognition. He was born to freed slaves from Kentucky. So Dunbar himself really has spent the majority of his life, or certainly all of his life, in the Dayton, Ohio area. And so never really kind of had the Southern experiences or whatever else, which becomes a mainstay of some of the poetry that he writes, which we'll talk about here in a second. But so anyway, he from there goes on at very young age. And keep in mind, this is interesting because Paul Laurence Dunbar dies in his early 30s. And so all of this kind of literary accomplishments, or these literary accomplishments that he makes, comes about very, very early in his life. So even at 14 years old, he's publishing poems in the newspaper in Dayton. when he's in high school, he's editing a short-lived Black newspaper that was kind of started by one of his classmates, which was one of the Wright brothers, Orville Wright in particular, who are also from Ohio, by the way. And so, you know, despite his erudition, despite how strong of a student he was, Dunbar was not able to attend college. So what he did was he took a job as an elevator operator, and so he would write poems, have them published, and then he would sell the books for $1 a piece to patrons that were riding the elevator. And so even through the midst of that, right, he had all of these people that were kind of supporting his work, former teachers that would ask him to come and do poetry readings. And so more specifically, later in his career, he moves to Chicago and becomes friends with Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass becomes a tremendous supporter of his by putting him in situations where he's able to meet the right people, where he's able to, again, kind of perform his poetry. And Douglass even referred to him as the most promising young colored man in America, specifically is how he described him. And so he goes on to publish, like I said, you know, another collection of poetry called The Majors and the Minors. And here's what's very interesting about this is that the interesting thing about Dunbar is that Dunbar wrote poetry in the more kind of literary traditional form in terms of using English, but then he also wrote poems in what is considered Black, or at the time, Negro dialect. And so the majors were what he called specifically those poems that were written in the more literary form, and he called the minors the poems that were written in the more Negro dialect. And interestingly enough, even though he wrote more of the poems in the major style, he becomes most well known for the poetry that he writes in the minor style, which troubled him, actually. He didn't like the fact, right? Or he certainly was, I would say, miffed by the fact that he was becoming more celebrated for the minor poems, or the poems that were written in this dialect. And so, again, he goes on, of course, right? He gets married to Alice Ruth Moore. But at this time, you know, in all the while, right, he's still continuing to contribute great poetry, but his health starts to deteriorate. And much of this, he was working in a library at a time, which he kind of attributed his kind of poor health and certainly his difficulty in breathing to the dust in the library that he worked at. And so he felt, and this thing also kind of led to him having, getting tuberculosis. And so even again, during this period, even though his health is deteriorating, he continues to writes essays, writes short stories, write novels, probably the most well-known being The Sport of the Gods. And eventually, like I say, succumbs to tuberculosis in February of 1906 at the age of 33. So that's just kind of like a rough kind of overview, if you will, of Dunbar. But Dunbar, I mean, this is kind of very significant in this way, right? When you think about Dunbar, right, and the way we think about poetry, I mean, we really have more kind of connection and more contact with Dunbar's work than we realize. So more specifically, Maya Angelou's seminal book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, comes from a line, the title of which comes from a line in one of Dunbar's poems called Sympathy. And so, like I said, we have this connection with him. But of course, right, throughout school, right, we're gonna learn more about people like Langston Hughes, and rightfully so. I'm a huge Hughes fan. That's a shout out to Rosalind too, because Rosalind turned me on to Hughes's short story work. I always give her credit for that, and I always tell her that. She's probably heard me say that 1,000 times. But anyway, but these are kind of like who gets kind of thrust in the forefront of our formal education. But then here are people like Dunbar who have done significant work and committed and contributed significantly, right, to our kind of African American literary aesthetic. And so I think that becomes important to kind of think about. And so when we look at, to kind of go back to We Wear the Mask, what's interesting about We Wear the Mask too, and also too, given Dunbar's kind of reticence about kind of being well known for the more dialectical poems poems of dialect that he uses, it reminds me of something that the scholar Houston Baker calls blues energy, which is what he says comes from the language of the African American artist. So more specifically, if we look at blues energy, and qualify what Dunbar does under what Baker refers to as a blues matrix. So Baker kind of using Derrida, the scholar Derrida, kind of utilizes this metaphor of the blues singer to represent the African-American author. So I want to read to you specifically what Baker says about that. Baker says that the blues singer and his performance serves as codifiers, absorbing and transforming discontinuous experience into formal, expressive instances that bear only the trace of origins, refusing to be pinned down to any final dualistic significance. Even as they speak of paralyzing absence and ineradicable desire, their instrumental rhythms suggest change, movement, action, continuance, unlimited and unending possibility. Like signification itself, blues are always nomadically wandering. So, and to come off of Baker's kind of perspective, if you will, about blues ideology and the blues matrix, Dr. Henry Louis Gates also calls, in talking about Zora Neale Hurston, refers to what Dunbar is doing as the difference between what we call speakerly text and writerly text. And so speakerly text, of course, right, is where we get these kind of, well, let me say this first, hold on. The writerly text is where we get this kind of non-contradictory realism. But in the speakerly text, this is where we get this kind of infinite play on signification upon realities, the masking, the hiding, right? The kind of play on words, all of these things, which is found in the rhythm of that blues, the rhythm of that dialect, right? So the thing is, right, is that Dunbar is actually speaking just as much about the African-American experience, right? And it right, as he were kind of writing in the more literary fashion. And this is what Zora Neale Hurston specifically herself kind of points out by saying, you know, when people have the language to speak in a certain way, that's the way that they talk. So people with more kind of, you know, with those literary devices and those literary markers and are able to kind of utilize that in their self-expression. So the people who use that dialect are expressing themselves in the language that they have, right? And so this is what Dunbar is doing. So it's kind of reductive on Dunbar's part a little bit here, not to kind of, you know, bash him on his birthday a little bit here, but it is reductive what he's doing in terms of how he is perceiving that work that he's doing in terms of dialect. And so that becomes a very kind of crucial component, right, to what he is discussing in his work. And so I want to talk a little bit specifically about Dunbar and kind of talk about, you know, thematically what he is doing in We Wear the Mask and how that applies to our theme here today. So, you know, the art of masking, as we know, I almost said class because I'm used to teaching my class, so I'm sorry about that. But the art of masking is a survival tool. Okay, it is specifically a survival tool for us. So Dunbar in this way gives expression to his opinion about the discrimination that's being faced by African Americans, right? The fact that during the Civil War, they lived in this kind of shared environment with people who had tremendous disdain for them, who didn't see them as human, who saw them only as, you know, the bottom line, finances, or you know, or using their bodies as fields, if you will, for degradation and for, you know, and to taint, so to speak. And so to survive, right, they had to bury the suffering. They had to bury the miseries, bury the pain to the bottom of their hearts specifically, right? And so what this toxic environment never allows them to do is to be able to release that agony. And so, you know, it's very interesting when I talk sometimes to young people and they say things like, oh, well, we tired of singing We Shall Overcome. We need to get out and protest. And I always remind young people, you now, because those, it's kind of like what the saying is, because somebody walked, you were able to run. Because they buried a lot of that inside, because they were not able to be as expressive about their agony and their anger, allows you to be able now, right, to be vociferous, to be able to say the things that you're saying, right, to be able to be out in the open. So I always tell students, like, don't sell We Shall Overcome short, okay? Because, We Shall Overcome happens so you are able to do what you're doing right now. And the thing is that while they may not have been as able to be expressive verbally in this way, look at what Dunbar does in his poetry. That's where the loudness is. That's where the voice comes out. And it's shaded in a lot of ways, right? It's very subtle in the way that it's done, but in that same respect, right, it's also very much so out in the open. And so, you know, the poem very much so kind of reflects this survival tool, right? This ability, right, of kind of using, right, these very things here that we're wearing now in terms of COVID, right, but to mask, right, the suffering that is happening. And so, you know, when we start thinking about his work thematically, right, when we start thinking about some of the major things of the poem being, of course, right, racism, but also, right, the appearance of this notion of appearance versus reality, lying, deceit, right? So you have the poet now, or Dunbar, I should say specifically, is illustrating the effects, right, of suffering that have been endured by Black people due to their race, right? That they're compelled to learn the art of fake happiness, right? This notion of that I can be one way around my people, but then I have to be another way around somewhere, around someone else. This being able, and this is something I think we as Black people become very, very good at, right? We become very good of masking those things. And the thing is not only do we become very good at it, but there is this notion, right, that we have to become good at it. That if we want to excel in these places and excel in these spots, right, that we have to, you know, mask ourselves in that way, that we can't, we have to downplay ourselves in a lot of ways. And it's not ideal. It doesn't mean that you know, kowtow into the man. It doesn't mean any of that, but it is a survival mechanism. And it is one that we have been utilizing ever since we were brought to this country. It's one that we've had to utilize. So I think that becomes very important to kind of reflect on and think about when we're looking at Dunbar's work. But moreover, when we kind of think about how does that apply to the work that we're doing now? How does that apply to what we see happening now? And I think about if in fact that what Dunbar is doing in We Wear the Mask, what you know, We Shall Overcome, right? If that in fact, you know, is the hieroglyphics of the movement, right? That has now allowed us to be able to be more specific, to take that, what would be the kind of akin to hieroglyphics or cave markers or whatever else at the early stages, right? To kind of bring that to the forefront, right? And then that comes in when we start into the, like, to the 70s, where we get the Blaxploitation movement, right? Where we see, you know, us kicking it to Whitey, kicking it to the man, right? And then we see that kind of evolve again in the 80s with the advent of rap, right? Which allows NWA to say, fuck the police, which allows Ice Cube later on in the 90s after the Rodney King riots to kind of talk about when he says specifically in his song from his Predator album, When Will They Shoot? When he says, the white man was something I tried to study, but I got my hands bloody. And he says that specifically to me because later in the song, he points out that they call me African-American like everything is fair. And if you think about that, we as people of color, but more specifically as Black people, because that's what we're talking about here today, but Black people, brown people, all of our Americanism, if you will, or our status as Americans and these people are distinguished by our race. African-American, Black American, Mexican-American, whatever else. White people don't get that, don't have to have that distinction. They're just white. So when Cube says, calling us African-American like everything is fair, get that out of the way, right? And this is the very same thing that Dunbar is saying when We Wear the Mask, that they don't need to know everything. They don't need to see everything. And this is where we get a lot of these traditions, right? Within the Black community, where, you know, those of you know, when we're at home and our mamas tell us what go on in my house, stays in my house, right? Don't go out this house telling all my business, all this, going to that school, making them people think I haven't taught you nothing. All of that becomes part of that masking. And it becomes necessary, right? To not tip your hand. As my grandfather used to tell me all the time, you never let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. That kind of thing, right? And it is this notion of having something for us that does not belong to them, right? And part of that, I think, is extended to that masking, if you will. And so, you know, now when you start to kind of think about people, when they're asking us specifically to wear a mask, when we start thinking about people kind of talking about masking as an infringement upon their rights, you know, that I have to wear a mask to the grocery store, all this. And here we are already masked, this invisible mask that we wear every day. not as an infringement on our rights, but as a way of maintaining our rights, as maintenance to our rights, as protection to our rights. And so these are the things I feel that Dunbar is elevating in his work, that these are the things that he's bringing to the fore. And these are the things I think that we need to remember on his birthday when we go back and I think put just as much credence and just as much respect on his more literary formed work as we do on his work that is in that dialect expression. That becomes very, very important. And I think we need to reflect on those things. And I think, and I'm so glad that Rosalind decided to use or thought about or brought up using Dunbar, because, right, the easiest thing to do is to go back to Hughes. Again, that's not a dig at Hughes, but we are most familiar with Hughes, right? And to be honest, we're only familiar with a little bit of Hughes. I mean, I really do, and I'm saying this again, I credit Rosalind with introducing me to the fact that Hughes had done other things besides poetry, right? So here we are with Dunbar, and there's Phyllis Wheatley, there's Gwendolyn Brooks, besides We Real Cool, right? Gwendolyn Brooks even said herself, right, I wish people knew I wrote other poems beside We Real Cool. So we kind of get stuck on these things and we think we know our artists, but we don't know them the way that we do. So I would challenge all of us today here as we move to the future, as we move into what many are referring to as the revolution, when we're seeing so many of these symbolic gestures being brought down, that we go back to the past, that we gain that knowledge and bring that knowledge with us so we can ask for something more than the taking down of statues, more than removing the Confederate flag, more than changing the words to a song or changing the name of buildings, or the Dixie Chicks dropping Dixie from their name. All of that shit that is just, you know, again, symbolic in form, that we can ask for real things. We can ask for seats at the table, that we can take that knowledge that we're equipped with and be able to stop people in their tracks and say, no, that's not how it is, right? So I would like to see us blend and marry the past with the present so we can, in fact, move forward. So I would like to ask the question to the attendees here today that, you know, now, and again, I mentioned this earlier, but to kind of bring this back up, you know, do we in fact wear the mask now? You know, is it time for us to demask? Can we afford to demask at this point? So I will take some questions and see and have discussions around that as well too. So, but yeah, can we afford to take the mask off? So we say yes, yes, more than, okay, somebody's just kind of, yeah. Yeah, it's code switching, which is what it's mostly known as, masking, right? We call it code switching. So someone says here, yes, I would love to demask, but we can't afford to take the mask off. But when you hear the language, right, that's being used right now, this is a new day. Change has come. We're not going back to the way that we were. Do you believe that? Not yet. Stay true, but yes, but sometimes when you're on survival mode, code switching can be detrimental. I don't think people can handle it. Okay. Right. Oh, got a lot of, okay, so we got a lot of comments. Who's gonna give me a question? Everybody got a question for me? They want to ask or something they would like for me to expound upon? So what about the penalties of taking off the mask? That's a good question. What happens when we do? Are we in a space right now that, even though, you know, I jokingly say to people right now that if there's something that you want done right now as a Black person, you better do it now. While everybody is like, yes, Black, right? While all these name changes and things are happening, you know, should we do the, you know, but can we afford to do that? Are we in a space now where we can freely, even in the midst of this movement, can we freely say what we want to at work? Can we freely express ourselves in this way? You know, I think, you know, to me, that becomes very difficult to kind of think about, because, you know, we're still working in spaces where some of us are the only Black person present, right? And, you know, I think about, you know, I was talking to a friend of mine who also, you know, who is a professor as well, and she made the comment, right, and something I didn't think about, that we as Black people, for example, when we get on panels and things of that nature, right? Or we get on, service committees, whatever. We tend to overserve because we don't want to look like we are not contributing, that we don't want to look like that we're not a team player. So we tend to overextend ourselves in that way. So to me, that's part of that masking. And I think that the ability for us to unmask really becomes contingent upon what people are doing on the other side of our mask. Will they allow us to unmask? Right. And I know what people say is, well, we don't have to wait for nobody's permission. It's not that you're asking for permission. It's asking for not having to feel the need to use that mask, I feel, as a form of protection.
Dr. Cunningham, there's a question.
Yes.
Do you have any recent books to recommend on racism?
Right. So, I mean, that's the hot topic now. You'll probably have some difficulty getting them, but certainly I always recommend Dr. Ibram Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, which I think is a very kind of extensive viewpoint on how racism has evolved in this country. He also has a new book out called How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I have not read yet, but I certainly recommend that. And I something else I like, Taylor Branch's his 3-part series on the King years, Parting the Waters, Pillars of Fire, and At Canaan's Edge. Those I think become very kind of interesting to kind of look at again this kind of evolution of racism. Certainly, Michelle Alexander's very popular work, The New Jim Crow, I think becomes integral in the way that we kind of look at where how slavery really in a lot of ways hasn't gone away. It's just turned into like free labor in terms of the prison system and this kind of education to prison pipelines and things of that nature. So those are some off the top of my head that I would recommend looking at.
Here's another question. Okay, I lost it in the chat. So can you tell us anything about Dunbar's family? Can you talk a little bit about his wife? Did he have any children? And then also, this question says, in addition to Douglas, were there any other persons that had a strong influence on Dunbar?
So early in his career, the very popular poet James Whitcomb Riley supported his work, wrote him a letter of encouragement. People like the novelist and critic William Dean Howells really supported him and got behind him. Dunbar, if I'm mistaken, if not mistaken, didn't have any children. He and his wife ended up separating, actually. And there's some instances also too online in some of his work where he's written her beautiful letters and that read like poetry, right? That are quite interesting, that I would recommend looking at. It's trying to get more of insight in terms of their relationship, what have you. But they ended up separating and not being together. And in fact, his parents also separated shortly after his birth too. So he had kind of, this kind of fracturing, so to speak, of his family a little bit, whatever else. But I think it's interesting too to note that even in him writing in this kind of more dialect becomes more about a lot of what he heard versus what he actually experienced. And so, and that was really kind of noted in the research that I've done on him and the things that I know about him is that that he didn't have the experience with, which is I think has a lot to do with his reticence about being so well known or certainly embraced for that poetry versus the more literary form of poetry, right, that he wrote, that he was in fact more well versed in. I have not written a book about Dunbar, no.
Here's another question.
Mm-hmm.
What have we lost by wearing a mask for so long? We're talking about the figurative mask.
Yes, right.
I feel regret for trying to live with authenticity for so long, and it still hasn't been enough.
Right. I mean, I think that, I think it's true that maybe we've lost some of our authentic, true, real selves, but we've had to, right? In a lot of ways, because here's the thing, right? As with anything, and this is what I tell, I think this is true now because I tell a lot of my young students that I connect with now and who and students I've taught over the years that, you have the right to express yourself and be your authentic self, but there is consequences in this life that come with that, right? And so we're made to suffer for expressing ourselves authentically. There's jobs that we won't get. There are, situations we won't be asked to participate in. I mean, in a lot of ways, I find myself, as someone with a PhD over the years, having to mask that people don't like very much to hear that you have a terminal degree, or they think that you think you know everything, or you think you're an expert in this or whatever else, or they think that you're going to talk above their heads or whatever else. And so you find yourself masking that. I certainly, me specifically, have found myself masking that. And so, and yes, I am losing kind of authenticity of self, but I also think that it's a way that it's a survival mechanism. It's what I've had to do to get along in this life, to get along in this world. Unfortunately, even to get along in a lot of spaces with my own people, it is, because I think that masking translates in a lot of ways for us amongst ourselves. And so, that's really what we have lost. The very thing that you mentioned about that loss of authenticity, of self. But unfortunately, we've had to do that. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think Black people need to have a few contingency plans lined up if they decide to demask at work?
Yes. Prepare to be fired. I'm, or prepare to be shunned, or prepare. I mean, I think you do. We need a backup. We really do. We need. I think that's the contingency plan, right? That we need to kind of think about, that the consequences for demasking will be that drastic, right? That people will and the thing is anytime we demask, we're automatically seen as aggressive. We're seen as confrontational. And it's unfortunate, right, that self-protection is seen as a threat to others. It's unfortunate, that is, but that is a lot of times what we're doing in those spaces, is that we're protecting ourselves, our own mental health. We're protecting our own, economic selves, right? How we function in these spaces, those things have to be protected. And so it's a lot of times the very reason we don't say anything. It's the thing, I've even found myself in situations where like, okay, well, I'm talking too much, let me be quiet because I don't want to sound like, or I sometimes, and this may not necessarily be something that's happened, but it becomes psychological in the sense that you start to think, well, if I say this, they're just going to ignore what I'm saying anyway, or they're not going to put any credence to what I'm saying anyway, so we don't say anything. So, but when we do, I just think we really do need to prepare for the most drastic of consequences to speaking out, because I would argue, and I put my money on it, nine times out of 10, it is going to be misinterpreted. And people will say, oh, you just conspiracy theory, oh, you just, no. When you live long enough in this life, that's what happens. Okay.
Are we truly able to demask? Because for many of us, masking is a learned behavior from birth.
Yeah, I don't know if we can yet. I mean, again, because I think so much of this is contingent. It's kind of like how we really need to look at assimilation, right? You can only truly assimilate it if the group in which you're trying to assimilate accepts you. And so we're working in a space where we're not being accepted. For as much as we're seeing happening right now, for as much as, Aunt Jemima is off the shelf and Uncle Ben is off the shelf and the cream of wheat man is being put out of business, as much as we're seeing these things happen, are we truly being accepted? Are people, and the thing is, it makes you suspicious. It makes you wonder, right? Are these things happening because people are worried about their economic bottom line, or do they really and truly care about us? So, and the thing is that we can't take that chance in thinking that they do. So we have to be masked up. And, and this is, again, what I try to express to young people, right? Where they say that they're going to do this and they're going to respect me and they're going to demand. And I'm like, you can demand it all you want to. They don't have to. They don't have to respect you. And so it would stand to reason, right, that we teach our young people how to mask in certain ways, not silence them. I don't even want to be silenced. Yeah, most of the time I'm not silent. I go ahead and talk, but I know what comes with that. you know, and I think we need to teach our young people what comes with that. When is it important to mask or whatever else? And even if we're not completely able to demask, we know that we can't have that mask too far away from us. We got to throw it back up just in case, as a means of protecting ourselves. Because again, if we go back to what Dunbar is saying, right, that mask is to not suppress, but to hide, to shade, right, the agony, the frustration, the anger, the pain, all of those things. That if any given time, if we really unleash the spirit on some people, it may be a dangerous situation for sure. Because yes. I think that's how much pent up frustration we have as a collective. Oh, here's a good one right here. How would you respond to a person who says he or she does not believe we continue to suffer from systemic racism here in our country? I wouldn't respond to that person, to be honest with you. As much, and because that's silly. It really is, that's silly. I'm sorry. And I say it's silly because in your specific space, in your life, you may not be experiencing, but I guarantee you're experiencing it in some way. You're experiencing it in some way. Because I always say, you know, as much people, for example, as many people who are out here marching, and we're having all these symbolic gestures taken down, and everybody's like, I'm with you, I stand for you. They're sending you the text message saying they love you and all this other stuff. Try to move into their neighborhoods and see what happens. You don't hear about anybody dismantling gentrification. You don't hear, and I'm talking specifically in this city. We don't hear anything about that. We don't hear anything about, you know, how these school systems and these schools and who gets to go to what school and what money gets sent to what school or whatever. You don't hear anything about that. That is part of that systemic racism, right? Systemic racism includes that if you live on the side of town where it's predominantly Black and Hispanic people, you're not going to get a Whole Foods. You're not going to get fresh fruits and fresh vegetables. That food deserts. That's part of systemic racism, right? So for someone to say that they aren't experiencing those things, they're living in a microcosm that I don't know what that is. I don't know where that is, but it's certainly utopic. And I would say argue non-existent.
We have a question, Dr. Cunningham. What is your take on All Lives Matter?
Yeah, all lives do matter, but that's not what we're talking about. All lives do matter, but that is not what we're talking about. Because if all lives in fact matter, we wouldn't have to say Black Lives Matter. That's to me the bottom line with it. We wouldn't have to worry, you know, those of us who with sons and daughters who are Black wouldn't have to say to them, this is what you do when the police comes to you. This is what happens when you do that. We wouldn't have to give these extra instructions, these extra guidelines, if in fact all lives matter. So no, they can take that and, you know, do something with that too, because if, like I say, if all lives matter, we wouldn't have to say Black Lives Matter.
How does burying our agony and masking it propel generational trauma?
It leads to, I think, mental illness that we are not addressing. I firmly believe that. I think about Jackie Robinson, and I think about Spike Lee talking about his theory, talking about, and not just his, but I mean, a lot of people have said this, but I think about Jackie Robinson in the sense, right, that I believe Jackie Robinson died in his 40s because he internalized so much of that, of the racism that was leveled at him. He internalized so much of that frustration and the inability to be able to retaliate, to say something about that, led to heart disease, led to diabetes, led to just significant health problems. And as we're learning more and more now that our mental health affects the rest of our health. And so when you're carrying those burdens and you're carrying that frustration, you know, how can you not get high blood pressure? How can you not eat yourself to diabetes? How can you, you know, how can you not find comfort in the greasiest of foods or whatever? I think all of that stuff is connected together because we are having to internalize so much stuff. And depression, as we know from mental illness circles, right, and talking about mental illness, depression is anger turned inward. And it's not so much, and I think our anger comes in a lot of different ways. I think we're angry at the people who are oppressing us. I think we're angry because we feel like we're allowing ourselves to be oppressed and there's nothing we can do about it. And so I think that it has turned into larger issues for us that has significantly reduced our life expectancy, that have significantly reduced the way that we deal with one another as Black men and Black women, the way that we connect to our children. I think we've been affected tremendously on all fronts by having to suppress those feelings and suppress those frustrations.
Would you say that Paul Laurence Dunbar's We Wear the Mask and some of his other works, would you say it's an early example of protest poetry?
Yes, I do. And I mean, he even has a poem called Protest that's written in dialect. And it's the poem about protest is about how he connects with another Black woman, how he put it in terms of relationships, among other things. And yeah, it is early. I mean, We Wear the Mask is a protest poem, absolutely a protest poem. It is calling, and it's calling attention, I think, for those who aren't living that life, saying this is what we have to do, right? This is how we have to live in this world. And then it's saying to us, right? It's self-aware in that way, right? That we know this is what we have to do to make it in this world. Right. And so in that regard, it absolutely becomes protest. And I think the thing is that we need to, so when we look at some of this earlier work, people like Dunbar, like Hughes, when we look at Maya Angelou or Alice Walker, or as I call her, Toni Morrison Holy, when we look at them, right, yeah, it might not be shouting it to the rooftops like you think it ought to happen, but protest comes in so many different forms. And this is why we continue to quote James Baldwin. This is why we continue to quote Toni Morrison and Maya Angelou and Paul Dunbar and so many of our great artists, because art is what you do, right? To paraphrase one of our greats, right? Toni Morrison, that art is what you do when it's time to take action. That's when it happens. That's where it happens, right? And so, we can't look to these works. We can't look to the past as being somewhat milquetoast in some way, because it's not milquetoast. It's just as fiery. I always say about the Freedom Riders, there are a bunch of 13, 14, 15-year-old people on that bus, headed to possible death. I can't tell you I would have done that. I can't say I would have done that. So the courage that it takes, right? The enlightenment that it takes, right? That's something I think we need to carry with us, no matter what we do, no matter how we move forward. That needs to remain with us. And that happens by us exposing ourselves more to the art of our people, because we are a strong people. To quote Lorraine Hansberry, to quote Walter Lee Younger from Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, we are a very proud people. Very proud people. Remember, no matter what age, we are a very proud people.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Cunningham. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. Our very first virtual Austin African American Book Festival.
Yes.
Happy birthday, Paul Laurence Dunbar.
Happy birthday.